The popular Parker Brothers board game Monopoly has a railroad in the middle of each side: the Pennsylvania, the Reading, the Short Line, and the B&O, named for America's most famous railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio. All, except for the Short Line, were named after great American railroads founded in the first big railroad boom from 1830 to 1860. The Baltimore and Ohio was the first railroad, eventually extending from Baltimore, Maryland, all the way to Chicago, Illinois. The Short Line is a different story. There never was such a railroad. It was, and still is, a name for the hundreds, if not thousands, of small railroad companies that built short railroad lines, most only a few miles long.
Well, there's lots of short line railroads, some of them industrial and some of them just built into areas where the big railroads didn't go in, but they acted as feeders. Now, when you had a short line railroad that loaded cars on their line, and then they had to interchange to a larger railroad.
One of those larger railroads, the Pennsylvania Railroad, became the standard of excellence in American railroading well into the 20th century. Founded in 1846, the venerable Pennsylvania Railroad, sometimes referred to as the Pennsy, has been heralded as the standard railroad of the world. The original line connected Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Almost immediately, it began buying up short feeder lines. Eventually, the tracks of the Pennsylvania Railroad served a region bounded by New York, Chicago, St. Louis, and Washington, D.C. In terms of traffic, the Pennsylvania Railroad was for many years the largest and richest in the world. Much of that success can be attributed to a brilliant strategic economic decision. Almost alone among American railroads, the Pennsylvania Railroad began designing and building its own steam locomotives at its Altoona, Pennsylvania repair shop. The Pennsylvania Railroad is believed to have been the fourth most prolific U.S. builder of steam locomotives. In doing so, it became a model of standardization, not only of locomotives and cars, but also color and paint schemes. This is why the Pennsylvania Railroad was known around the world as the Standard, the Microsoft of the railroad age. The fourth railroad on the Monopoly board is the Reading. Take a ride on the Reading. If you pass go, collect $200, says one of the chance cards in the Monopoly game. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, later the Reading Company, is actually supposed to be pronounced Reading. It was originally chartered to build a line between Reading and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The original Reading Main Line extended south from the coal mining town of Pottsville to Reading and then onward to Philadelphia. Upon its completion in 1843, the line had the distinction of being the first double-track main line in the United States. It was a company that made huge profits by hauling coal from mines to cities, demonstrating another avenue for our railroads to make huge sums of money: the single-purpose rail line. The rail line designed to move one kind of resource, a practice copied many times over as the railroads moved into the mineral-rich West and the timber-rich Northwest. Not on the Monopoly board, the Erie Railroad was chartered in April 1832 to run from the banks of the Hudson River to the shores of Lake Erie, with the restriction that it could not enter any other state or connect with railroads from other states. A restriction which in typical railroad arrogance, it ignored, dipping into Pennsylvania on the way to its final destination, Dunkirk, New York. At that moment, the Erie Railroad became the longest continuous railroad in the world. Its president, Benjamin Loader, planned a huge celebration to mark its completion. 2 special trains were arranged to make the trip across the line. On board were 298 guests, including President Millard Fillmore, 4 members of his cabinet, 2 future presidential hopefuls, William Seward, of Seward's Folly fame, and Stephen A. Douglas, who would go on to debate Abraham Lincoln in the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. And the Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, who rode in a rocking chair strapped down on a flatbed car. Covered in a rug, bottle of rum in hand, he eloquently gave speeches to all who would listen at the train's many whistle stops. Such was the fascination with American railroads that had swept the country. But the granddaddy of all the pre-Civil War Eastern Railroad lines was the New York Central Railroad. Known simply as the New York Central, the NYC was the brainchild of one of railroading's earliest risk-takers, Erastus Corning. Born in 1794, Corning was an iron merchant who quickly saw the potential of railroads to make money and invested heavily in New York State's many rail lines. By 1851, Corning realized that New York's mishmash of separately owned railroads was not only inefficient, it was unprofitable. At the same time, he also saw the market possibilities to make lots of money if the lines were merged into one corporation. So, just like George Brown, who 20 years earlier brought together investors to create the B&O Railroad, Corning gathered together presidents and owners from 8 of New York's small feeder lines. These lines serviced towns along the Erie Canal and the Hudson River, and brought goods and passengers down to New York City. He convinced the owners that merging into a giant corporation would not only work better and more efficiently, it would make them millionaires. Everyone agreed, and 2 years later, the New York Central was born, with Corning as president. Almost overnight, Corning had created an economic powerhouse, the likes of which the nation had never seen before. The likes of which only the new and innovative railroad industry could create. The merger was a stunning feat with consequences that would ripple through the American economy for the next 150 years, because Corning did more than just form a corporation. He set a new standard for industrial growth. He demonstrated that growth could occur not only organically, but also through mergers. The desire for rapid and sustainable growth organically had been a slow process. Mergers speeded it up. It was no accident that Corning's move to form a corporation that could immediately compete for the growing railroad traffic occurred in New York State. Wall Street was the only place in the country with the financial power to pull off such a deal and make the merger work. Corning went on to become one of the country's leading industrialists. Corning guided the New York Central until the end of the Civil War, when he resigned. 2 years later, it would become the flagship of Cornelius Vanderbilt's railroad empire. Made famous by Johnny Cash's song, Rock Island Line, Illinois' Rock Island and LaSalle Railroad Company was incorporated in 1847. The first train reached Rock Island in 1854, becoming the first railroad to connect Chicago with the Mississippi River, a river railroads would need to cross to push further west. Indeed, 3 years later, Abraham Lincoln represented the Rock Island Line in an important lawsuit regarding bridges over navigable rivers.
The United States is full of rivers and uneven country, and so that means there are any number of bridges and viaducts that have to be bridged. So the railroads are the great bridge builders. It's possible to build a ferry system across a river, but much more efficient and faster to have a bridge across that river, and they do.
Indeed, America's railroad bridges became the 19th century's engineering wonder of the world. By 1860, the North and Midwest had constructed railroad networks that linked every major city. In the heavily settled Corn Belt, from Ohio to Iowa, over 80% of farms were within 5 miles of a railway. However, in the South, the story of railroads was radically different. Though the South had been an early leader in railway building, the region had concentrated on short lines, linking cotton regions to ocean and river ports. There was no network of rail lines connecting one part of the South with another. This lack of a network would become a major handicap during the American Civil War, a war in which, for the first time, railroads were about to play a pivotal role.
Hi, I'm Bill Ambrose. If you like this video, subscribe so we can bring you more programming from our studio. Thank you for subscribing.